Lucas knew the feeling all too well. It was late afternoon. The light outside his office window had started to soften, and the task he'd promised himself he'd finish by lunch was still sitting there, untouched. The report was open on his screen, the cursor blinking like it was keeping score. Beside it, his phone lit up again. A message, then a news alert, then a quick scroll that somehow turned into 10 more minutes disappearing into nothing. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face. "I'll start properly in a minute," he muttered to himself, as if saying it out loud might make it true. But the minute never really came. That was the cruel part. Lucas wasn't careless. He wasn't lazy. He was smart, capable, the sort of man who could solve other people's problems before breakfast. Yet when it came to his own important work, he kept drifting. Deadlines began to stack up. Small delays turned into bigger ones. And with each passing day, the pressure built quietly in the background, like a storm he could hear approaching but couldn't quite face. At night, the guilt hit harder. He'd sit in the dark with his laptop closed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the same thought over and over. Why do I keep doing this to myself? It wasn't just frustration anymore. It was embarrassment. A low, constant sense that he was letting himself down. And maybe that's the strange thing about procrastination. From the outside, it looks simple. Just do the task. Get on with it. Stop wasting time. But if it were really that simple, none of us would be here, stuck in the same loop, promising ourselves tomorrow will be different. Lucas decided he'd had enough. Not in a dramatic, overnight kind of way, but in the quiet way people do when they're finally tired of their own patterns. He started looking for answers, expecting to hear the usual advice about better planning, stricter routines, and stronger self-control. What he found instead stopped him in his tracks. Because procrastination, he discovered, isn't just about poor time management. It's far more human than that. It's emotional, deeply emotional. And once Lucas understood that, the whole problem started to look different. Not easier exactly, but clearer. And that clarity opened the door to something he'd been missing for years. The real reason he kept putting things off, even when he knew it was hurting him. Lucas kept telling himself the same thing every morning. Today's the day. The laptop was open, the task was waiting, and he even had a mug of coffee sitting beside him like a faithful witness. But instead of starting, he would check his emails again. Then the news. Then the weather. Then his phone. 10 minutes would disappear, then 20, then an hour, and by the time he looked up, the day already felt half gone. It wasn't that Lucas didn't care. That was the cruel part. He cared too much. Every unfinished task sat in his chest like a stone. A report for work. A call he'd been avoiding. A project he'd promised he'd finally get moving on. The more important it was, the heavier it felt. And the heavier it felt, the more he wanted to escape it. One afternoon, after another round of "I'll start after lunch" turned into "maybe tomorrow," Lucas stared at his screen and muttered, "What is wrong with me?" He wasn't stupid. He wasn't lazy. He was capable, experienced, reliable. Yet somehow, the moment something mattered, his brain seemed to betray him. That's when the explanation started to shift everything. Procrastination, he learned, isn't just poor discipline or bad planning. It's often emotion wearing a disguise. When a task brings discomfort, uncertainty, fear of failing, or the pressure to be perfect, the brain doesn't always respond with logic. It responds with relief-seeking. It looks for the quickest way to reduce the tension right now, even if that choice creates more pain later. Suddenly, scrolling, snacking, tidying the desk, or answering a trivial message feels oddly urgent. Lucas could see it now in himself. The task wasn't just work. In his mind, it had become a threat. What if he got it wrong? What if it took longer than expected? What if he started and realized he wasn't as good as people thought? So his brain offered him a deal. Avoid the discomfort now, and we'll deal with the consequences later. Of course, later always arrives. And that's the trap. The relief is instant, but temporary. The guilt comes back stronger. The deadline moves closer. Anxiety rises. Then the task feels even bigger, and the cycle tightens like a knot. If this sounds familiar, you're not alone. In fact, if you've ever delayed something important while knowing full well it's hurting you, you've already met this pattern. The good news is that understanding the pattern changes everything. Because once you see procrastination for what it really is, you can stop treating yourself like the problem and start dealing with the real one. And that's exactly where Lucas begins to turn the corner. Lucas sat at his desk long after the room had gone quiet. The phone was face down beside his notebook. The deadline was still there, and yet something had shifted. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't calling himself lazy. He was starting to see the pattern for what it really was, a mind trying to escape discomfort in the fastest way it knew how. That realization didn't make the work disappear, but it changed the battle. Instead of waiting for motivation like it was some magical guest that might finally arrive, he began smaller. 5 minutes, one email, one paragraph, one uncomfortable step. And strangely enough, once he stopped demanding perfection, the pressure eased. The task that had felt like a mountain became something he could actually climb. Because that's the hidden trap, isn't it? Procrastination convinces us we need to feel ready before we begin. But readiness often comes after action, not before it. The brain loves comfort, novelty, and instant relief. That's why the quick scroll, the snack, the random video, the "I'll start after this" all feels so convincing in the moment. They don't solve the problem, but they do soften the discomfort just enough to keep us stuck. Lucas looked back at the days he'd lost and the guilt that had followed, and he saw something important. Shame had never helped him move forward. It only made the task feel heavier. But understanding did. Once he knew why he avoided the work, he could meet himself with a bit more patience and a lot less self-attack. And that, more than any productivity hack, was what started to change things. Maybe that's the real lesson here. We don't procrastinate because we're broken. We procrastinate because we're human. And human brains are wired to dodge pain, delay uncertainty, and chase relief. The good news is that once you can see the mechanism, you're no longer blind to it. You can pause, name what you're feeling, and choose the next small step instead of the easiest escape. So if this story sounded a bit too familiar, maybe take a moment and think about the one thing you've been putting off the longest. What feeling have you been trying to avoid underneath it all? If this video helped you see procrastination differently, give it a like so more people can find it too. And if you want more simple, practical videos like this, consider subscribing because there's a lot more to uncover about the strange, fascinating ways our minds work.